Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Babies in Common show. We just decided to stop calling it a Videocast podcast because that's kind of hard to say. So we're just calling it a show that's published as a video as well as a podcast. So welcome to the Babies in Common show. I'm Jeanette Mesite, I'm the owner of Babies in Common. I'm a childbirth educator, a retired birth doula, mostly, and I'm also an internationally board certified lactation consultant. And I also have 2 teenagers, and I'm here with Melissa as well.
Hello, I'm Melissa Dubois, and I've practiced as a registered nurse in the field of obstetrics and gynecology since 2011. I've worked in all types of hospital, clinic, and home settings, including working for almost 10 years as a labor and delivery nurse in 5 different hospitals. I've been teaching childbirth and new baby classes to expecting families since 2011, and I teach for Jeanette Babies in Common. And I'm also a certified lactation counselor. I'm currently providing VNA services for home birth families, and I'm also the mother of 3 small children. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Before we get started with the episode, I just want to have a quick reminder that anything Jeanette or I or any of our guests say during this conversation should not be taken as medical advice. Please consult your own qualified healthcare professional for questions about you or your baby's health. Also, the opinions expressed during this conversation are personal to the host and guests and any participants and do not ever represent the views or policies of any current or former employer, including hospitals and clinicians. So for full review of our disclaimer, please visit babiesincommon.com/disclaimer. All right.
All right, so on to our show. So today is June 1st, 2020, and today we'll be discussing babies and sleep, pressure, progression, and practical expectations. And we'll be talking about all of that with our guest, Teresa Stewart, who has 20 years of experience educating, empowering, and supporting women and their families prenatally through their child's adolescence even. And she's a child development specialist, maternal child health educator, family sleep consultant, first aid and CPR instructor, childbirth educator, and mental health advocate. A whole lot of awesome things wrapped in one package. She works with families, helping them to navigate the endless sources of information and decide what works best for their family. All her work is grounded in child development, emotional well-being, and trauma-informed practices. So thank you for joining us today, Teresa, and all of our participants.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Yes, thank you for having me. So happy to be here.
Yay. So I'll start. So your background, it focuses on child development and emotional well-being. And I know you say sleep is never just about sleep, and that when a baby isn't sleeping, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So what do you mean by those comments?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Jeanette. If you ever, see me present live or go to my website, I have pictures of icebergs on my website and in all the slides I share, with sleep as the tip of the iceberg. Because, families reach out to me and they say, my baby is not sleeping, my child is not sleeping, I'm not sleeping. And a lot of times families are expecting, a quick behavioral fix to that. But the way that I work is really exploring a number of factors for why aren't you sleeping? Because sleep has biological components, it has emotional components, it has so many different physical health and mental health components to it, nutrition, stages of development, so many different family dynamics. It's definitely not a one size fits all. And as I'm sure we're going to get into, in our talk today, it is not something that I would ever prescribe a family to address just behaviorally, or definitely not through what many families are familiar with, extinction or cry it out methods. And unfortunately, that is how a lot of social media and blogs frame sleep, that it is just behavioral. So it's really important to me right from the get-go that anybody knows who's talking with me or working with me, that I do take this very holistic and integrative approach to sleep. And it's never just about sleep.
And that is why you're like one of a few only sleep consultants that I recommend.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad you shared the other pieces of my background, because although I do practice in the sleep field, I would like to think I bring so much more to the table than just the field of sleep consultant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know like your background, some sleep consultants, it seems like some of the programs that people go through are very short. You don't take into consider all of that, and they're also not usually evidence-based. So a lot of evidence that is touted as evidence, but when you look at the studies, they're not really that well done. Really interesting because I'm now studying, as we've talked about before, I'm studying infant sleep now too, a lot more. And yeah, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say and learn more over time as well, in addition to all of our experiences raising our own kids.
Right, right. And I think what you mentioned there, Jeanette, is really important for people to understand. One of the frustrations that I do have in my industry is that there is not one very clear path on how you can become a sleep consultant. And right now in the United States and internationally, actually, almost anybody can hang a shingle and say, I'm a sleep consultant. And there's many, many different ways. Some people only participate in a 6-week to 3-month online program. And not to diminish what online programs can be, because they can be wonderful, but some of them really are only 6 to 12 weeks long. Some of them, somebody wrote a book and then decides to take their book and turn it into their own program. So it's important that as a consumer in this field, that you do your research and know the background of the person that you're working with.
That was one thing that really was surprising in a good way, very refreshing. In the interest of full disclosure, I took one of Teresa's online workshops because when I was having trouble getting my 3-year-old to sleep when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I had also a 6-year-old at the time. Well, I still have them, but haven't been successful in giving them away. No, I'm kidding. But, I went online one day on Facebook, and it was just a horrible, like crying, throwing himself off the bed, just kind of like nobody wanted to sleep that night. And I just went on Facebook and I was like, this is literally torture. This is horrible torture. And so what do I do? Because I don't know how to help him. I don't know how to get sleep. Nobody's getting sleep. He's not getting sleep. I'm going to have a baby. What am I going to do? And someone was like, oh, you should check out Teresa Stewart Family Solutions because she does like private in-home consultations, but she also does these workshops. So long story short, I signed up for one of your workshops, and basically it was set up kind of like these learning modules through Facebook, where every day there was certain assigned reading that we would do, and then we would share with you our personal struggles and family dynamic. But it wasn't just like, here are tips for how to get your baby to sleep. We talked about so many things. We talked about, like you said, mental health. We talked about activity during the day. We talked about science behind the brain and sleep in children and adults and how that's different. And we talked about the relationship between me and my husband. We talked about so many things, right? And I was like, wow, this is a really like holistic, comprehensive approach, because like, as you said, it's never just about sleep. A new baby changes the entire dynamic of the family, whether it's your first baby or your 15th baby, it changes the entire dynamic of the family. And so that's one thing that I learned a ton about, so many things, not just strategies to get my son to sleep better. And when I had my daughter, who's now 10 months old, I took another one of your classes focused just on the newborn time, which we're going to kind of focus on in today's show, because I was like, man, even if some of this is, I might already know because I've done a workshop before. I was like, I wish I had this one. I had it first, so I'm not going to make that mistake again. I'm going to refresh my memory about what newborn sleep is like, so that, I'm more prepared than I was ever with my first, because my first did not sleep for more than 5 hours in a row in one stretch until he was over 2 years old. So that was tough. So let's start at the very beginning. Right? The very beginning is a very good place to start. What aspects of pregnancy and birth, may impact the sleep of a baby? A lot of people don't think about that. So let's start with that.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And you probably remember in the newborn class you took with me, we talk about that in one lesson as well. And even though everybody already has their baby at that point in the newborn group, I do want them to reflect a little bit on that pregnancy and birth experience, whether it is your first baby or your 15th baby. That pregnancy experience, that birth experience, that immediate postpartum experience shapes a lot about us as parents, and it shapes a lot about our babies that sometimes we don't understand. Birth trauma, unfortunately, is something that I do support a lot of families around in the postpartum. And I just want people to start to think, what was this experience like for me? What was this experience like for my partner, for my baby? Physically, has it impacted my body or my baby's body in a way? I'm sure Jeanette and Melissa, you both see babies, with torticollis, the neck tightening, and, tongue ties or lip ties. The birth experience for a variety of reasons can sometimes be physically traumatic on a baby. So before we even start to talk about, is my baby sleeping? We really have to look at how is my baby physically feeling, and emotionally, what has my baby been through? And feeding wise, is my baby feeding well? Because feeding is definitely a priority over sleep in those very early days. So I just like to guide a discussion with families and help them think through that birth experience. And a lot of times families say to me, I would have never thought that experience during birth is now impacting. And sometimes it's even impacting babies 6-12 months down the road. It's not always in that newborn period.
Yeah, that is so great to think about that. And even just when you're talking about pregnancy, like the position of the baby in the body before the baby's born. And some babies sleep more in utero than others seem to, like people will say like, oh, this baby's much more active than my other one. Well, that may come out in their personality afterwards too. And they may seem like they need less or more sleep one way or another, right?
That's so interesting you say that. I have two kids who are totally different from the other. And whatever works for my daughter has never worked for my son, and vice versa. And, they're much older now. My son's almost 9 and my daughter's 13. But the babies they were in utero were definitely, there were temperament traits there that continued in infancy that, I wish somebody had told me 13 years ago when I had my first, that there might be that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That
absolutely.
brings up a really good point. One of the things that you talk a lot about in your workshops and consults is a baby's temperament and learning the differences. I didn't find out till years after I had my first that my first would have been considered a high needs baby, right?
Yeah.
And so things that other people told me to do, like, oh my God, you never put him down. That's why he's, that's why he won't go to anybody. That's, you're overly attached to the baby, and if you got to let him cry it out because you're spoiling him by holding him too much. And I would go home and sob when people told me that, because I wanted nothing more than to put him down. He would never let me. I mean, he would scream bloody murder until he vomited if he was, not ready to be put down. And so my husband and I basically survived by tag teaming baby wearing him, or letting him sleep on our chest like 24/7, because there was no other way to get him to be calm, right? And in hindsight, he also had torticollis, and I tell you, like a lot of other things, after malpositioned, very long back labor because he had his head was bitten, and so many things I wish I'd known. But it's sometimes, I actually, when people take my new baby ready class, which I teach prenatally, I talk a lot about how, like, you don't get to choose the baby that the baby gods give you, right? And certain things that other parents tell you, friends, coworkers, family members, like, oh my God, you have to try this. The reason why the baby's not doing this is because you're not doing that. Like, it's good to listen to people's advice, but take it with a grain of salt, because they might have a completely different baby with a different temperament that something works for that yours does not. My niece, for example, was somebody who kind of fell into a pattern, which some people might be tricked into thinking was a schedule in the first 5 months of her life, right? But she just naturally kind of had a pattern to her waking and sleeping. None of my kids ever did. I would track for days and days, and it would be, just all over the place. So every baby is different, and I mean, I know we know that, but, sometimes we forget it, that every baby has a different personality in the womb, out of the womb. So, but generally speaking, there are some characteristics that are similar about newborns and what is considered typical for a newborn sleep pattern. So can you talk a little bit about, what is physiologically normal for a newborn in the first 6 weeks of life?
Yeah, great question. And I hope we can go back to the temperament piece and more soon too, because there's so much you said there, Melissa, that I want to dive into. But, so what is normal? More is probably falling within normal than abnormal with infants. So it's important to remember that there is a very wide range of to be expected with our newborns. I think there's a lot of myths with newborns that we probably want to kind of myth bust today. So, one thing that people often say is that newborns need a lot of sleep. Now, yes, by and large, that statement is true. But where it is very deceptive is that they don't need a lot of sleep in long stretches. So you're expecting your baby, you're tired through pregnancy or the adoption process. You're thinking, okay, when this baby gets here, everyone keeps telling me my newborn's gonna need a lot of sleep. People also like to say, sleep when your baby is sleeping. So if you combine those two things, you have the expectation that you're probably gonna be getting some good long stretches. And to anybody who has not had a baby yet, I'm sorry to bust that bubble for you today. For anybody who's living through the first 6 weeks, I want you to know that what you're living is very normal and common. Because although babies need a lot of sleep, they can't stay awake for a very long time in the first 6 weeks. They don't give us very long stretches. If you're getting like a 2 to 4 hour stretch overnight, that's sleepy through the night for a newborn. The other thing that I think catches a lot of people off guard with newborn babies in the first 6 weeks is that what we would consider bedtime, and putting that in air quotes for people who are listening, tends to be really late. So there's a lot of cluster feeding, there's a lot of napping late into the evening, but a normal bedtime where you might get that 2 to 4 hour stretch in the first 6 weeks is going to be around 10, 11, maybe even midnight.
It's always so fun when I hear parents ask over the years, well, I'm putting him to bed at like 7 o'clock or 6 o'clock. And I'm like, that's really cute that, you're thinking that's bedtime because your baby's going to sleep for what, an hour and a half to 3 hours if you're lucky. And so
Mhm.
which one of those times counts as bedtime? You
Right.
just can never predict it. And sometimes the kids are going to sleep like, if your baby sleeps a 4 hour chunk, maybe that starts at 3 a.m. You never know. So why are we even calling it bedtime? It's our bedtime. We're trying to put ourselves to bed, but
Right.
even our schedule as a new parent is very, very changed by what our baby needs to do.
We might be
Absolutely.
in the bed. That doesn't mean it's bedtime.
Yep, yep, absolutely.
So Jeanette, can I ask you a question? As far as an infant feeding specialist, can you talk a little bit to why baby sleeping longer chunks in the newborn time frame actually isn't healthy for them? It's not even like a bonus if you get it. Like it's not a healthy thing for a newborn baby to sleep long stretches.
Yeah, there's some babies who just by their nature somehow they sleep too many 4 or 5 hour stretches, and as a new parent, your gut says, "Ooh, yay, I get to sleep longer. That's so great." But then your baby's not eating often enough, and then they don't grow well. And in certain instances, I've seen situations where, your baby's doctor may not always ask all the right questions about the sleep situation because they have a lot of people to see that day, or they're trying to touch on lots of topics that moment they're talking to you. And so it may be that your baby's not gaining well because they're not eating frequently enough. Or
Mhm.
sometimes babies are sleeping on the breast, or they fall asleep while they're eating in whatever fashion they're eating. And we forget to count those moments as sleep too. And so parents like, they never sleep. And I'm like, just while I've been with you, they've been sleeping for 45 minutes, but you forgot to count that. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, having, in that first, generally I say within the first month or so, until your baby's gaining really well via the way that you want to feed them. So if your goal is exclusive breastfeeding, if your baby's not gaining well by 3 weeks, then we need to continue to wake them up every 3 hours, meaning that the start of the feeding to the start of the feeding should only be 3 hours apart at the max, which really only gives you like, I don't know, maybe 2 hours of sleep at a time. But not every
Mhm.
baby's even going to sleep that long. So, and maybe in that 24-hour period, you could have 1 4 to 5 hour sleep if your baby even does that, which many, many don't. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and
that's
that's
what
it's
I'd
hard
say.
because we get a lot of pressure from family, that reinforces what's actually not healthy for babies. So if a parent says, "Oh yeah," well, first of all, we have to stop using this term. And I'll get on my soapbox for a minute. Please bear with me. Of calling baby is you have a good baby, right? Meaning that like the baby is sleeping so much, they're a good baby, and if they're not sleeping for hours and hours at a time, they're a bad baby. Because as we've just learned in the first 15 minutes of this show, it is normal and healthy for newborn babies to be waking every 2 to 3 hours to eat. That is what they need to grow. They are rapidly growing their brain and their body in that time, of their life. And so, you know, our family and friends well-meaning, but they reinforce this idea that if your baby is waking frequently to eat, that they are being spoiled or they're a bad baby, right? So like a good baby, let's not judge our babies based
No,
on healthy
and
habits they
Melissa,
have to like eat when
if
they're
I could add to that too, Melissa, and then it judges the parent, right? Because if you have that good
yes.
baby, then you're a good parent, and if you have that
Oh
bad baby,
yeah,
yeah, I'm right there on that soapbox with you. It drives me crazy. I don't
you're
know
doing
how our
something
babies,
wrong.
I don't know how our baby's sleep problems or eating patterns have become synonymous with a temperament trait, and then even temperament traits, if you have that higher needs baby that, Melissa, you shared you had with your first, and I definitely had with my first, that can also start to somehow in our society become indicative of your parenting. So
Absolutely. Yeah. So, for those out there that are your baby's eating through the night, that they're feeding every 2 to 3 hours, it's tough. It's hard work. It's even harder when people don't understand that that's biologically normal for your baby, but know that that is. And so I actually don't ask people since I had my first, like, how's the baby sleeping or is he sleeping through the night? I say like, so do you feel like you're getting enough sleep or are you able to nap during the day? And if they're like, oh, the baby's up every 2 to 3 hours, I'm like, oh, that's good. That's good. Try to like normalize. I actually had a lactation consultant once when I worked in New York. She said whenever somebody would ask her if her baby was sleeping through the night, she would say, "Oh, dear God, no, thank you so much for your concern. He's waking every 2 to 3 hours to eat as he should." Like,
that's a
way
good
to flip
answer.
it around on people, like, "Oh, no, dear God, he's not. So thank you for your concern." No.
Oh, I love that. I'm gonna have to adopt that. I love it.
That's good.
That's great. So I remember a long time ago hearing you speak, Teresa, and you talked about the idea of sleep pressure in
Mhm.
infants. So what even is that? And how is that in the first 6 weeks of life versus how does that change?
Yeah, this is such a good question and so important for families to understand. And in those online workshops that Melissa was mentioning, it's the second lesson in all my groups talking about the biology of sleep, because this is where so many of the myths are born from when people don't understand. And unfortunately, there's a lot of really well-known sleep books out there that don't touch upon sleep biology either, and it just unfortunately lies the foundation for miscommunication and misinformation. So basically in the human body, we have two sleep drives, which are the physiological components to how our body does two things: fall asleep and stay asleep. The first and the most dominant sleep drive is our circadian rhythm, which people also refer to as the biological clock. But the circadian rhythm is really not mature and working and impacting infant sleep until about 4 months old. And I know we're going to talk about that magic 4-month-old period in a little bit. But in the first 4 months, the circadian rhythm is pretty much null and void. And what is really organizing infant sleep is the second sleep drive, which officially is called the homeostatic state. But its nickname is sleep pressure. And sleep pressure is much easier to say over and over again than the homeostatic state. But basically, sleep pressure is the sensation of being tired. So when we're awake, even as adults, we build up what is called sleep pressure. And I'm just going to use adults as an example so people can really understand what it is. If you as an adult aren't getting the deep restorative nighttime sleep that you need, you then have less of a tolerance for sleep pressure during the day. So we've all been there before. We haven't gotten the sleep that we need, and probably mid-afternoon, maybe right about now, 2 o'clock, you start to just feel really tired, and it comes impossible to hold up your head, and your eyes close, and you're going like this, and your chin's falling to your chest, and you all of a sudden like jerk your head up, and you're like, oh my gosh, did anybody see me? Did I snore? Did I drool? But that really heavy sensation of suddenly being tired is a high amount of sleep pressure. Now, sleep pressure in infants and toddlers, and especially in newborns, it's a delicate balance of building it because you want to capture enough sleep pressure that if you're trying to get your baby to go to sleep, and definitely in this newborn stage, we're talking about, soothing your baby, feeding your baby, swaddling your baby, helping your baby fall asleep. You do want enough sleep pressure that that physical sensation to sleep is there. But we have to be really careful to not have a baby awake too long, because if that sleep pressure builds too much and they're not falling asleep, then the brain thinks something's wrong. The brain thinks, why am I not falling asleep? And the brain releases hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And there's no long-term harm here, but in the short term, that release of cortisol is going to keep the baby awake. So all of us who've had babies before have been there at one point or another, where you can clearly tell your baby's exhausted, but nothing you're doing is working. The feeding isn't soothing them, the holding them, the rocking them, they're just overstimulated. So in the first 4 months of life, sleep pressure really drives all sleep, because again, the circadian rhythm isn't yet developed and mature. But this is also why babies sleep pretty much around the clock, because they can't tolerate physiologically long periods of wakefulness. So in the first 6 weeks of life, we're really only looking at babies being awake no more than an hour and a half at a time. But when I say no more than an hour and a half at a time, many babies in the first 6 weeks can't even do that. We're talking about a 45-minute wake window. And then that sleep pressure builds and they need to go back to sleep.
How then does infant sleep, how is it different than adult sleep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So, I mean, the first 6 weeks is very different because, again, they are designed to kind of just sleep in these short bursts around the clock. And, you know, as Jeanette so eloquently already stated, like, you do want to be careful the naps aren't too long. And I agree with that 2-hour stretch of sleep at most for during the day, because not only might it negatively impact the feeding relationship, if a baby is sleeping too much during the day, they have to build that sleep pressure and have to be awake somewhere, and then it's going to happen more overnight. But the other thing to keep in mind, you know, for infancy across the board, so that's until age 1, is that even once the circadian rhythm does start to mature around 4 months old, where a baby's deep sleep is supposed to happen is very different than adult deep sleep. So there's something called a chronotype, and recent research is showing that there's actually 4 types of chronotypes in adult sleepers. 80% of adult sleepers sleep the same way. So the guidance I'm going to give right now is based on the 80% of sleepers, but just know that some adults do sleep differently. But 80% of us as adults are designed to go to sleep somewhere between 10 and midnight, start our night in light sleep, and end our night in deep sleep. Okay, so the last 1/3 of an adult sleep cycle is where you're supposed to have your deepest, most restorative sleep. Now, unfortunately, in our babies, once they do start to consolidate more sleep, their deep sleep happens first. So 4, 5, 6 hours, 4 months old and older, of nice consolidated deep sleep. Wake up, feed, go back to sleep. But then that last part of the night, where we as adults are designed to be sleeping soundly, our babies are going to wake up more. And I think it's really hard for a lot of parents to be in it, but especially if you don't know that it's normal, because then again, you're going to start to feel like my baby has a sleep problem. Why are they waking up at 3, 4, 5 a.m.? And it feels very emotional as an adult to have to respond to a baby at that time.
So how do you juggle that? How do you suggest parents juggle sleep and like the very different schedule of their baby's sleep pressure?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing we have to do is have those practical expectations and know and educate our families that this is going to happen. So we can start to have a plan. And I wish more pediatricians talked about this, because I find, unfortunately, that pediatricians don't even know about the sleep cycles. And sometimes they give parents some information of saying, well, maybe you should just wean down those feeds at 3, 4, 5 a.m. But honestly, that's going to be a recipe for disaster.
Well, I think it's
to try to
also
do
like I know in the world of feeding, like baby doctors don't get much, if any, training on infant feeding. Is that the same? I would assume it is, but is it the same? Is that what you hear from doctors?
Yeah, it is. It is, unfortunately. There is a study, it's about 20 years old now, through Harvard School of Public Health. I wish they would do another one, that looked at the training pediatricians got in terms of infant sleep and infant feeding. And for sleep, they found that the average pediatrician only in all of medical school and all of their residency had 4 hours of education around sleep. And by and large, that was either safe sleep or medical aspects like apnea, and when to refer out. It was even worse for feeding. That same study from Harvard School of Public Health found that for infant feeding, it was only an hour and a half of education throughout all of medical school.
Yeah, and usually it's
And
medical school, not even residency.
Right, right. And it's really the pediatricians who then seek it out further, who then get that IBCLC or do additional work around child development or sleep. But just by and large, pediatricians don't have this education built into their programming.
And this
So I know
isn't a knock. Yeah, this isn't a knock on pediatricians, right?
no, no, and I was
A lot of things.
It's just the reality. Like, some people
mm,
think a pediatrician is an expert in every aspect of a child's life, but the curriculum in medical school and in residency, the learning surrounding what a pediatrician studies is like the diagnosis and treatment of diseases that are in children and well development in children. There are other specialists that specialize in sleep, in lactation, in behavior, right, in mental health. And those might be your pediatrician if they have sought out extra credentialing, done a fellowship, or done additional workshops, but it very likely is not. And especially if it's not something that they advertise as a passion of theirs, right? So know that people do this all the time. Parents think that, well, the pediatrician told me to cry it out, or the pediatrician told me to add ice to the bottle, or to introduce formula, and we're going to talk about some of these myths. They're not bad people, they just have not had the training. They are not experts most of the time in infant feeding or in infant sleep, and so asking them for their advice, they're going to give you what they know, and it might be very little, it might be outdated, and it might even be dangerous. If they're advocating for things that are like going to limit the amount of times a newborn baby is going to eat during the night, for example.
No, I'm glad that you said that, Melissa. And I was going to say that I know it's well intentioned. I don't think that pediatricians by and large are maliciously giving this advice. And it's a very necessary, needed, and wonderful profession. But you spoke very eloquently to they're not always the specialist. And part of my own experience becoming a parent with a higher needs baby, and after having some birth trauma of my own, and the advice that I got from the pediatrician that felt like it just wasn't what my baby needed. I also experienced a lot of judgment from some professionals when I first became a parent. And even though it was still, at the time, I was very invested in the child development and child health fields, I was not yet in sleep consulting. It was really the experience of becoming a parent and having my own baby and feeling like there has to be a way to give more holistic and integrated advice than what I received as a parent. That kind of was a turning point in my own career.
Awesome. Yeah, so many of what we do in this field of work kind of comes, not always, but many times I hear it comes from like personal experiences where you just didn't get the help that you needed, and then you became that advocate for your children, or for yourself, and then decided to take that to help advocate for others. So thank you for doing that. You do help, and you have helped a lot of people.
Oh, thank you.
So one thing that I have talked with a lot of families about one way or another, I'm curious what the official Teresa Stewart recommendation is. Do babies really need to be in dark and quiet? Do we need sound machines? Do they do better if they're next to the parent in the same room? Like, put all that together? What's the recommendation?
Oh boy, I mean, this is definitely an area where one size does not fit all. And there's the balance of the AAP recommendations of safe sleep that come from a very, public health overall safety message, which, somebody with a public health background, I do appreciate. But I think some of the safe to sleep messaging we hear also does not really take into consideration that brain development or that emotional development or just how babies are hardwired for touch. So this is definitely a question that each family is going to have to navigate on their own. And my hope is to give you, different areas to explore and figure out what works for my baby and my family. I think that in terms of the environment, let's start there, the dark and quiet, and the sound machine is probably the easier aspect to answer. So what we do know about the human body is that physiologically, to get into deep sleep, it is helpful to be able to lower our body temperature. Now, this becomes more important after 4 months old when the circadian rhythm matures, because it really is the circadian rhythm that dictates getting into that deep sleep, the release of melatonin, the hormone that we need to release to fall asleep. So the environment is helpful. It's never going to be hurtful in the first 4 months, but it does biologically become a little bit more helpful 4 months on. So studies have shown that the ideal sleep temperature for infants and young children is between 65 and 72 degrees. For adults, studies have actually shown even cooler is better. So if you're arguing with, your partner or somebody in your house about what the temperature should be at night, studies show that most adults sleep best. And when I say best, I mean deepest quality sleep between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, which
Wow.
is cold.
I have to say, I do like it cold because then I can put a lot of blankets on myself.
I'm the same way. My husband's like, why are we blasting this AC when you then have 5 blankets on top of you? But but just purely speaking, from getting into that deep sleep, best chance of releasing melatonin, studies have shown, again, for most adults, 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and for most babies and young toddlers, 65 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. If you can't control the temperature in that way, having a fan in the room to keep the air moving can be very helpful. And then now this has safety properties as well, keeping the oxygen flowing, but also just helping you get into that deeper sleep. Dark, as you might see behind me, for those of you watching the video, I've got 2 layers of blackout curtains on the window behind me, and there's an AC installed here because I personally sleep better in the dark. One of my kids is the same way, sleeps best in the dark. My other kid, doesn't matter where he's sleeping, he is a very regular sleeper and he will fall asleep anywhere. So he could have all the light in the world and he will still sleep soundly. So there is, some differences here biologically and temperament wise. But usually when I'm working with families between 4 and 6 months old, I would recommend, the room being darker versus lighter for nighttime sleep. Because as the circadian rhythm starts to mature around 4 months old, it is really looking for cues. What do you want me to do? I've never had to do this before. And the circadian rhythm is reinforced by light and dark cycles. The circadian rhythm is located in our brain, actually right behind our eyes. And even with eyes closed, the circadian rhythm does perceive light exposure. Now, light
that is super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and now light doesn't cause the wake up, okay? But what it will do, like let's say your baby wakes up at 5:30 in the morning, because it's actually pretty late these days at 5:30, and they're exposed to a lot of light. What that light will tell its circadian rhythm is you should wake up again this time tomorrow. Okay, so it might not have caused the wake up on Monday, but it can reinforce the wake up on Tuesday. Now, some babies will eat and go back to sleep and it doesn't bother them that light is still there. So a family may say to me, well, this isn't a problem, this is working. But if you have that baby who's waking up and not going back to sleep, and the family is saying, I really don't want to start my day at 5:30, then one way that we can shift that circadian rhythm is with the dark exposure. So again, we might not eliminate the wake up entirely. Baby might need to feed, but if we keep it dark, that helps the circadian rhythm understand I should go back to sleep. Does that start to answer the question, Jeanette, around the darkness, or did you have more
Yeah,
that you
no,
wanted?
I think it's the darkness, it's the silent. I sort of think about, I lived in West Africa for a couple years and there was no noise from any of those babies. I lived in the center of a village and there was no way you couldn't hear what was going on in the next houses. And babies just weren't crying in the middle of the night. Granted, they were sleeping right next to their mothers always,
Yeah.
and nursing all throughout the night. But it was just, and in that case, when the light came into their houses, which had very small windows, then it was time for everybody to wake up. So it was very different. So I like how you use, we have to manipulate our environment to get the sleep that we want because we live in a modern situation where we might be able to do that. But
Yeah.
also the temperature wise, in where I was living in West Africa, it was pretty cool at night. But also if you're a baby who's lying right next to your warm mother, you're going to be warm. But
Yeah.
then there's people in the Scandinavian countries who will sleep their babies outside in a stroller, but the baby is super, super well wrapped up. They're just breathing cool air, but otherwise their temperature is really good. So I've had a lot of families that I walk into their house to do a home visit for feeding, and it's so hot in there. And I'm like, do you like it this way, or do you have it? And they're like, oh no, we just thought we hate it so hot, but we were told the baby needed it warm. And I'm like, it's 83 in here. Do you see on the wall? Like, it does not have to be this hot. Like, oh great, we'll turn the AC on then. I'm like, thank you, because
Yeah.
we're all suffering, but the family is miserable because they thought they were supposed to have it even hotter.
Right.
If
Absolutely.
72 is good, then I guess
Comes from
82
a
is
lot of
better.
that comes from a lot of my grandparents' generation for sure. Like my grandmother is so worried about the thought of a baby being too cold. And I mean, she grew up very poor in the Great Depression, where they didn't always have access to basic utilities. And I mean, her mother was like the town's lay midwife. Like she never had any formal training, but like my grandmother remembers like when babies being born, like putting them behind the oven, if they were born too little, to like help them survive. So like this is where like my 86-year-old grandmother is coming from, and I feel like this is where this like babies have to be bundled
Oh no.
up to the nines, with 3 hats on in the summertime, and that might not necessarily be good. But that reminds me of a good question, Teresa, because I also want to talk about where babies are actually sleeping with parents or not. But before we do that, can you answer 2 questions for me? One, if the room is so cool, what should a baby be wearing to sleep? And 2, there are a lot of products out there for parents to swaddle babies, since swaddling with a thin blanket can be challenging. There's ones with Velcro and whatnot. Do you recommend swaddling? And what would you recommend a baby be swaddled in? Because this is a question that I think a lot of parents have, like, how do I dress my baby that's safe for sleep? And in our grandparents' generation, they wanted to put a lot of blankets on the baby, but we now know that can be a suffocation hazard, right? So anything else you can say about that?
Yeah, I mean, oh my goodness, there's so much to say, and we could just talk, for an hour probably on, culture and society and generational wisdom, and it's all valid and important. There's so many roots there to dig through. So,
hold on, before you answer this question, that is the title of your PhD dissertation. Just putting it out there.
What did I say? Culture, society, and generational wisdom.
Sleep.
I love it. I'm sold. I'll be at your defense.
I think, Jeanette, you must be spying on me, because I do keep telling my husband I want to go back for my PhD. And he's like, yeah, how's that working?
I dream of it myself. If someone would fund it, I'd be game.
Right. Yeah, I might need my 8-year-old to get a little older too before I could take that on. But yes, thank you for the encouragement. But yeah, and I do acknowledge, that when I'm sharing, some of what I am, that, by and large, the clientele I work with does live in the United States. I do work with some families internationally. I've worked with some families in Japan, Dubai, Mexico, Canada, various places in Europe, but by and large, my clientele is from the United States. But in terms of, what should they be wearing in these temperatures, what is safe and swaddling, young babies, first 3 months, they do need a little bit more help regulating body temperature and blood flow than older babies. And I think that's where a lot of our grandparents' worries of, oh, are they dressed warm enough, comes from. But most babies just 1 layer warmer than what you'd be comfortable in. So if it's between 65, 72 degrees in the house, maybe like a light pair of thin cotton pajamas. And then if you're using a swaddle blanket or a sleep sack over that. What can be helpful in babies is making sure their feet stay covered, either in that swaddle or sleep sack or a pair of socks. Kind of a corny saying, but warm feet promote sleep because it helps with the blood circulation. What people should know about young babies is the hands are always going to be cold. So don't judge it by their hands. Even if they're wrapped up in that swaddle and then you take them out, the hands are going to feel cold. And a lot of times parents really worry. It just has to do with the blood circulation. The stomach or the back of the neck is where you want to feel your baby. And as long as either the stomach or the back of the neck feels comfortable to the touch, your baby is dressed appropriately. If you touch the belly or the back of the neck and that feels cold, then we probably need to put another layer on the baby. Or if you feel the back of the neck or the stomach and it's really hot, clammy, sweaty, then they're probably overdressed. And we want to get a fan in the room, lower the temperature, remove a layer. In terms of swaddling, some experts out there are adamant that every single baby has to be swaddled. And others say, nope, don't ever swaddle, because then you're teaching your baby to not, work through the motions and fall back to sleep. So again, this is an area where parents kind of have to navigate and figure what works best for your family and your baby. The reason swaddling is something to consider is because our youngest babies have what is called a moral reflex. So when they're lying on their back and they're going from deep sleep into light sleep and they're startled, those arms are going to fly up. And with that flying up of their arms, they tend to wake. And as I hope has been, clear so far today, they're not going to be able to just go right back to sleep on their own. So if we want to start to shape, okay, so shape sleep and help a baby learn to connect sleep cycles, that's where swaddling can be helpful, because then you limit that full-on moral reflex. Babies don't always enjoy the process of being swaddling, so that's definitely something I would want families to know. A lot of families say, well, they cry the whole time I swaddle them. And to that, I'll often say, well, they also cry when you put them in the car seat, or they cry when you're changing their diaper, and we still put them in car seats and change their diapers. So yes, they might cry while being swaddled, and then you're going to have to soothe them in some way. This is where the work of Dr. Harvey Karp is very well known. The swaddle first, then the sway, then the shushing, then the sucking, doing the other S's to calm the baby down. But not every baby likes to be swaddled in the same way. So there's a lot of products out there. Personally, I think there's probably too many products out there. It's a little overwhelming. I probably don't even know all the newest ones anymore. But some babies do like a little bit of motion. And if you're really swaddling tightly, that does not work for their nervous system and how they regulate. So if you do have a baby who likes to move a little bit, I really love the Woombi. The Woombi is also very easy to use. It's just a little sack you put your baby in and zip up. Couldn't be easier. But with the Woombi, babies can move their arms a little bit. I've even seen babies put the arm like up to their chin, and then they kind of suck on their hand over the Woombi. Other babies do need more the arms across the chest, or down by the hip. But what I think is important for families to know developmentally, you don't want to restrict the motion of the legs. It's really important that their feet can move. Yes, babies are going to kick while swaddled. That is okay. There is something called hip dysplasia. Some babies are born with hip dysplasia. Some babies develop it early on. So you don't want to force the hips in any unnatural position. Let the lower body do whatever the baby wants it to do.
I have 3 kids with 3 very different swaddling preferences. My son, Pierce, the high needs baby, needed to be swaddled arms down like a straight jacket and bounced on a yoga ball. That Jeanette saved my life by teaching me this. I go over to my new baby ready class. My son, Asa, I literally could take him from 6 feet in the air, drop him unswaddled into the crib, and he would stay asleep. And my daughter Marcy, she would fight swaddling more than any baby in the 14 years I've been a nurse have ever fight swaddling. She would fight and fight until she could break her way out. It didn't matter how long we did it for. It didn't matter if I soothed her while we did it. So that Woombi that you were talking about, you had actually recommended that to us, and that was kind of like the perfect combination for her, because she did have a pretty big moral reflex, but she hated, like it was a personal offense to her to be swaddled. Like, don't restrict my freedom, And so there's different things for different babies out there. But that moral reflex, for some babies, it just they like they just keep re-agitating themselves, and if we can calm that a little bit, it can help. Like you said, shape sleep. Because we can't train babies to do anything. They're not dogs.
No, definitely not. And, this is just an observation. There is no scientific backing on this. Maybe it's part of my dissertation one day, who knows? But I have noticed that the babies who tend to be the most active and resist that swaddling early on do tend to be your early crawlers and walkers. So there does.
Oh my God! That is Marcy. You're blowing my mind. She's 10 months old. This girl's almost walking. Wow.
Yeah, my daughter hated swaddling. It was just as you're describing, like a personal affront to her. It was terrible, and she ended up walking at 9 months. And then my son, who loves swaddling, he didn't walk until he was 18 months old. But I'm not just doing this observation based on my own kids. This is an observation that I've seen in many, many clients over the years. So I do think, some kids are just more sensory seekers. They need a little bit more more motion, more movement, more of everything. But the flip side to that is they also tend to be your kids who kind of thrive earlier gross motor wise. And that is not to say that, early walking is better than later walking, because every brain develops differently. And some kids are more focused on the fine motor and the language first and do the gross motor later. But I have noticed that connection, that our babies who are harder to swaddle and who move more early on tend to keep up with that. I'm going to move more and faster sooner as I go through my first year.
You mentioned the 5 S's, and I just wanted to add that that is just a person who took some very traditional practices that have been happening in families since the dawn of time around the world and package them into a method that sounds good with all things that start with S.
Yeah.
It's not like he invented the ideas. So we need to, give props to the originators of all those ideas around the world back in the old days, the dawn of time. And
Absolutely.
also, I think that there are so many products on the market, and unfortunately, there are too many that really immobilize babies for too long, and they sleep long, and so that's really appealing to us as parents. But often what we're seeing in the world of feeding is that those kids are not growing very well, and the parents are just sort of like, I don't know what to do, I'll just wrap them up and make them nice and tight, whether it's in a swaddle or a container that also tightens. I don't want to name one in particular because I don't like it. But it's really sad, because I think parents then are kind of, it's like feed, diaper change, go to sleep, I'm gonna tie you up and you'll sleep, and then it's like, okay, now you've got this like 6-week-old that you don't even know because you haven't spent time with them because you were so busy trying to get them to be fed and changed and to sleep again. Versus
Yeah.
I show parents so many like physical things they can do with their baby to move their baby's body in different ways, many of which are actually working on that moral reflex so they can
Yeah.
integrate it appropriately, so that then they'll be able to sleep better. Because getting rid of the swaddle around 2 months, if we can, is a good idea. And if we can't, then I think, some babies need a swaddle for longer, but let's look at why can't they
Right.
sleep without it? What's going on, versus going, well, my baby needs it, so I'll do it. And I do like that you mentioned the arms across the chest, or up at the, the neck, the hands up at the neck when you're swaddling. If that is possible for your baby to sleep that way, that's preferable. And you might even get more sleep out of your baby, because the baby can like squeeze those little fingers out into their mouth, and maybe they'll chew on their fingers for a little while and you get 10 more minutes of sleep. That can be really desirable. But I've absolutely met babies where hands up does not work for that kid, and we're trying to make sure that the baby's growing well and sleeping well, but you're also moving your baby and playing with them and giving them that exercise, so to speak, for their brain as well as for their body. And that's great for bonding all at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think you just had so many important things there. We do tend as a culture, society, to be hyper focused on the sleep, the feeding on a pattern, right? The control aspect. And I think it's hard for so many of us to go into parenthood because there's very little control, really, for a very long time. I mean, my oldest is 13 and a half. I still don't have all the control that I would like. But helping families know, again, what to expect. Hopefully we're helping to do that today. But I think that play piece, that bonding piece is so important. And this is part of what is under the iceberg, because as human beings, we're designed for relationships and interaction and touch. We're designed for eye contact, we're designed for movement. And I do have a hard time, and I've had a hard time for a while with a lot of the products out in the market that are, packaged in a way of put your baby down so you can get things done, which, no judgment. We all need to put baby down and get things done at some point. But it then becomes very easy to always put our babies down. And there's so much brain development and emotional development that happens when they're awake and in our arms, or awake and just on a safe space on the floor where they can move and they can roll and they can reach and they can grab. If we're always putting babies in something that limits their movement and limits their interaction, it is going to impact their feeding, it is going to impact their sleep, but it's also going to impact their development and their ability to just go through all the different milestones that they're supposed to.
All right, and if you enjoyed that, just wait till part 2, where we discuss even more about infant sleep with Teresa Stewart.